Good evening, everyone. A little bit early, but I had intended to start this at 7, so that's not a problem. A little bit impromptu once again, this being one of those things which I guess I don't want my channel to become a streaming channel, but I had a lot on my mind today and wanted to articulate it in the best way possible, and hopefully get some interaction from chat and the like, and see what they think, basically. Because I've been thinking about some of the deeper issues, I suppose, confronting society at the moment. Gone very, I guess, like outside of the general news cycle, political bubble that tends to foam up in the everyday of this channel. And of course, it gets me thinking about the direction which I want to take the channel, the direction the channel is currently going in, and that side of things. So I want to talk to you, the audience, about that as well. I'll just pop up the chat so I can see you, and there's that. So, good evening, Joe Neverton, Ellis Frost, Lord Pterodax, the likes, all the regulars. Nice to see you. But yeah, so one of the things which I was thinking about today, and really over the course of this, is about the circles I currently run in. So as most of you know, I do frequently guest on the Academic Agents channel, and I spend quite a lot of time in his Discord, which I'm in as a courtesy, because they don't think that I'm, right-wing enough, like on economics and the like, but there you go. Yes, remember the 9th of December? I don't think that's correct, just saying that. But there you go. And I was thinking about the way in which the circles I currently live in conceptualise. So, one of the big things is the right, I would call them, like, they consider that the right doesn't exist, right? They think it's a number of disparate groups who are only connected by their sort of shared opposition to the left, who are the collective. So, because they're collective, they can define themselves as the left, whereas the right almost wholly more individualistic. However, I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that. But one of the big things is also that the left do not have... the left has never produced anything of value. They basically exist as a thorn in the side of the quote-unquote right, and that they lack... what productive value do they bring? They seem to destroy governments when they get... and nations when they get into power. They don't learn from their mistakes. They steep everything in the language of morality. They're not afraid to use violence, and they're overall quite chaotic because they don't follow what the right seem to regard as sort of more logical stuff. We see this in the, I guess, perpetuation of stereotypes and sort of a priori rationalizations of things like the gender wage gap, which has been thoroughly debunked by economists, most of whom sit on the right, for, years and years and years, and yet, it doesn't know. Thank you for the super chats that's going. Finally, one of you lads streams at a bloody sane hour. Yeah, it's really early today. I was going to leave it till later, and I can't stop thinking about all this stuff, and so I'm trying to get it out of my head, basically, before my brain explodes. Not necessarily because what I have to say is particularly entertaining, but or particularly thoughtful. Just it's one of those things which goes round and round and round and round. Is anyone actually right-wing enough? Sargon is too right-wing for Patreon. Yeah, it's bizarre. The whole Patreon saga. I was having a chat to him today. He's he's all right. He still makes money from YouTube, etc. He's not quite destitute yet, and he lives quite frugally, so he's got enough of that. But it's definitely like a political thing. Like, he hasn't done anything wrong on that side of things. But there we go. Matchstick says art and feelings. Yeah, so we'll come on to this in a second. So Joan Everton, the right is a collection of disparate groups, as is the left. However, the right is bound by tradition, order, and law. Perhaps I'm thinking this idea through. Yeah, quite possibly, because I'm trying to think about what connects the right into something which could be definable as a group, and I suppose not necessarily tradition, but the value in tradition, because there are different traditions. They believe they know all kinds of things despite not learning anything new after the age of 13. Oh, it's only 2:30. Yeah, it's 6:30 here. And that sort of thing. Oh, do we know why Sargon was removed? I think it's purely political. Not to get too conspiracy theoristy. He was removed the same day as James Allsop. Is it James Allsop? But basically, it's a politics thing, right? Milo joined Patreon the other day. I think there's just been a new wave of purges, and he's been caught up in it because there's also been talk of like Visa and MasterCard having hands in things, which is one of the reasons why, because we were talking about what possible payment processor could we appeal to Elon Musk to create PayPal too, but really the problem seems to be emerging that it's not even necessarily on the level of the processors as much as it is the providers in general behind them. So there we go. They mentioned the white, I understand what he meant by that phrase, and I knew exactly why he said it. I just wouldn't have said it myself, because it's caused him so much trouble in the end, and it's also such an abstract, I guess, reason for most people who do not know anything about the real alt-right or the opposition or Sargon himself's trolly nature. It's very, very easy to get taken out of context. So it's going, I don't think the right wing are all that bound together, just like the left wing. You'll always have the insane extremities, and they diverge greatly from the saner. Yeah. So the other thing I was thinking about, one of the other things I was thinking about was the centre, and really how politics differs from, I suppose, like other distributions. So if you have a normal distribution, you get this sort of peak in the middle and the fringes. But in politics, the fringes shout the loudest, and society dictates which fringe is allowed to shout sort of how far. So you end up with like a tolerable level of extreme on both sides, which is far greater on the left at the moment than it is on the right. But you also end up with, in fact, so far gone on the right that it's approaching, but not quite at sort of mainstream. And when we start to see sort of an exponential increase in things starting to affect the centre, we will know that the left is. I mean, we already know the left is going too far, but the wider effects, when they start to affect the wider population, the question is, we know that that's too far, but whether or not, I suppose, whether or not it's stoppable at that point, and that side of things. Have you noticed that many Christian conservative philosophers and thinkers often seem to be genuinely anti-capitalist and value the state more? When it comes to Christianity and capitalism, I like most people who, like a lot of Christians I meet are very compassionate people. I don't really listen to that many Christian philosophers, although my dad occasionally sends me stuff. And yeah, so I'm going to answer that question. Sorry, I'm reading the rest of the chat, and I'm going, I should answer this question and this question, but no, I'm going to go one at a time. So when it comes to Christians, they tend to most of them are quite compassionate people, if sometimes uninformed, particularly when it comes to things like foreign aid. So they tend to look at, as with most compassionate people, they tend to be quite distressed by the problems in society, which means that they end up becoming quite anti-capitalist, even if they're quite sheltered, because in the realm of their experience, they believe that, quite rightly, that this particular piece of suffering shouldn't be happening, and some of them end up attributing this to capitalism. Quite a few of them attribute a lot of things to capitalism and inequality, which don't necessarily stem from those things, but maybe a byproduct of existence itself. And then you get the idea of solutions, and so obviously the moral language sits on the left, it sits with socialists, it sits with communists, and they go, look, we have this wonderful alternative to capitalism. And unless you do your reading, it can be quite a sticky trap to fall into. If far-rightists like Andrew Anglin, I'm almost grateful I don't know who that is, I suppose, got kicked from Patreon, and now centre-rightists get kicked, who will they go for next? Other centrists. I tend to think it comes in waves. So I think generally that probably this will calm down so that people will forget about it for a brief period of time. And then another wave of purges will come when something else inflammatory happens. That's the way I tend to think about it. Let me see. I see the left as the militant youth railing against what we on the right regard as the natural way. I think AA has a point when he says most people's default is conservative. Well, you could say most people's default is conservative. I think most young people's sort of natural is rebellious. Not left, not anything else, rebellious. We see this continual cycle between, through all of history, basically, and even if you just go from the 50s, when you had the post-war generation, which then became the 60s and 70s, which was sort of rejecting of the sort of austere, rationed mindset and the military influence of the population. And then in the 90s, we had like a tech resurgence and more of a return to that, sort of back in there, and now we're going back through this. But I also think that we are, because we're in an unprecedented period of history, because we're at a time where we have had peace in this country, speaking specifically of the UK because that's my experience, for half a century or more now, and you're just going, okay, we don't really have an answer for this. I lean on, Peter Hitchens was talking about the removal of, like when the Soviet Union dissolved, basically, and one of the members of the Soviet Union was there, and he said, I apologise to the world, and to America in particular, I think it was, for depriving you of an enemy. We have deprived you of an enemy. And I think that's one of those things which is aiding the dissolution of, I guess, shared values in a way, because you don't have a common enemy. Like the commonality is not there, and people are searching for it. And now the common enemy appears to be sort of this vague idea of discrimination, which people are struggling to put down in a way, a lot of people are struggling to put down in a way which makes sense to a lot of other people. So you get this idea that, is inequality bad? And it's like, sometimes. Is discrimination bad? Sometimes. Is discrimination based on arbitrary characteristics bad? Yeah, but at the same time we've got all these groups, and if we categorise them in a specific way, then we find that some groups are doing better than others, and we want to simplify the concept. And again, this is a big thing which I was thinking about over the last couple of days, which is this idea that the majority of people want some... think of the most average person you can. And now remember that half of all the other people in society are stupider than this person. So you're going, most people want a relatively simplistic idea. They don't want to be told that it's too complicated for any one person to fully conceptualize. They don't want to be told that it's too complicated for any one person, group, or otherwise to solve. Because that would mean basically voiding their chance at, particularly for the young, like they void their chance at making an quote-unquote impact in the world. Like in the war generations, it was like the young people wanted to do something which mattered, and they wanted to do something which mattered, and so you see many kids, from 15 even, as young as, signing up and faking their age and joining the military because they have this grand enemy that's threatening Europe, be that Germany or anything else. And then in the 60s it became about free love and rejecting the idea that we have to maintain all these values and traditions, and obviously the birth control pill played a massive role in that as well. And then we move into the 90s, and people go, well, actually STDs are a bad thing, and we actually did have some value in not necessarily tradition, but family certainly, and the idea of settling and being and not being miserable at 40. And now we are all the way back around again, where people are saying, I should do this, and we end up generating cat people, Joe in Everton, I'm quite young. I'm in my early 20s. I went through an angry leftist phase. Yeah, I think most people go through an angry phase, and the left capitalised on it. They're not that bad. I didn't want kids, etc. Yeah, been there. Though I changed within the space of a year, I'm a bit odd. I think a lot of people do this, particularly when they end up either being forced into or taking responsibility. I know I certainly didn't grow up until, I was a very angsty teenager until I had a year where a number of friends of mine died, and it really was a shock to the system. I took responsibility and I ended up getting a proper job, and then trying to learn what values and things were. So it's I don't like the fact that my friends died. I like the fact that I woke up to being responsible, I suppose, for myself, and then recognizing that things like redistribution of wealth sort of void personal responsibility. Like, all the hardcore leftists I know of this day haven't particularly suffered, although they tend to know quite a few people who have, and so they either end up because you can go one of two ways. It's like if you take two snow globes and you smash them together, and one of them will shatter and the other will not, typically. Alright, because one's inferior and one's not, and so the same situation can either you either smash yourself to pieces on it, or you smash the situation to pieces effectively. And so you get people who have suffered who buy into, I guess, the more left-leaning narrative, which tends to be, you're a victim of this and it's not fair and it's not right, and maybe we can correct this injustice in this way. Or you get to people who say, it's not fair, there was nothing you could do about it, you need to move on, you need to take personal responsibility for getting yourself back on track, and if you can't do that, then you need to build a network of people who can help you do that. But it's not the responsibility of the network before you've built it. It's not necessarily their responsibility to sort of pick you up. It's nice if they do, willingly and by choice, but it's not like an intrinsic I suppose, responsibility, which is one of those strange things. It's like in the conceptualization, in the view of the homeless, for instance. Like, if your city has a homeless problem or whatever, then have you as a society failed? That's one of the big questions. Where you go, homelessness is a sign of society not working, for instance, which is one of those big questions, because I don't know exactly how to solve it with the current incentives, but it is one of those things I've been thinking about in the way that we view the world, because I do not know necessarily whether or not most of the right, like, I'm going to use the left-right thing because I've got nothing better to conceptualize it as right now, how they solve it, but how they solve it, particularly, this is one of the big reasons why I'm not laissez-faire when it comes to something like capitalism, because the right maintains that in a laissez-faire system, charities and charitable organisations will fill the void where the welfare system provides a perverse incentive to remain impoverished, and they maintain, of course, that the right-leaning people typically will pay out more. They're more altruistic, whereas the left make more of a noise about it. They go, I'm altruistic and I give to charity, but on average, you give less or you don't. This is why so many people call out the hypocrisy of rich celebrities saying, I'll take in migrant families, etc. It's like, to date, they have taken no migrant families. And that sort of thing. Virtue signalling is not exclusive to the left, but at the moment seems to be, because the left narrative is the dominant one, it's profitable for them to basically cover themselves in ashes and sackcloth and claim that, cry out as loud as they can about how virtuous they are. So it's going, so quote mine, 2018, leftists are inferior. I didn't say I didn't say the left was inferior, but leftists, I would say, are inferior if we're talking specifically about the extreme edges. Joan Neverton, I would say no. The majority of the homeless suffer from mental illness, which pushes them towards such choices. We should treat it as a public health issue. Entirely possible. Bad parenting, sorry. But it's not even necessarily bad parenting, and you can also make an argument that regardless of parenting, if you are subject to bad parenting, right, how do we create a person from that who sort of is going to be either a good parent in future or at least functional, because otherwise you just end up abandoning them, and I don't think that's sort of ethically conscionable. Even most US conservatives would be okay with some form of welfare for the legit infirm and ill if it was well policed. Yeah. And this brings us on to sort of the deserving poor versus... I was thinking about this a few years back, particularly the concept of you have to do a certain amount of work, and you could replace some public services with work experience. Workers who are on benefits and need to get out, but then of course that comes with the difficulty of, so take someone like my mum who is on welfare. She's quite heavily disabled at the moment. She hopes she'll get better, but we'll see. And but it took a long time because she's got a slightly non-standard illness. It is a genuine illness. She can't move very well at all, but the diagnosis was jumping all over the place for a number of years, and the concept of becoming registered disabled, etc., because they put it off and off and off and off, meant that it took something like 18 months from their first application to get registered disabled, so that you didn't have this. And the idea that someone, taxman, would be coming round to her door and saying, you should be working, I don't know, as someone cleaning up the community or something like that, when she can only walk for 15 to 20 minutes a day at that point, is just ridiculous. So I think so many government policies end up being too broad or too catch-all, and if they're too broad in that everyone can get it, then the value of it becomes worthless, and you end up with a huge amount of net takers. And if it becomes so niche that hardly anyone can qualify, then so many people get left in the dark that they can't get there. And that's not even like, my mum's an intelligent person, so it's not even, you imagine someone who's not technically literate, technologically literate, so and trying to navigate through sort of government websites and all these forms and files, etc. So it's the idea of what could replace that. I mean, this isn't even what I plan to speak about particularly this evening, but we will go on to other stuff. There's 84 people watching. That's more than I expected. The main thing I was thinking about was what's the left's utility. So it's quite chaotic. The left is quite chaotic. I mean, if we take Jordan Peterson's conceptualization of sort of take masculine, feminine, order, chaos, that sort of thing. If the right is order, the left is chaos. Why does it exist? Well, partially it exists to oppose the imposition of too much order, because too much order is great for some people and not great for a lot of people. A lot of people say that people on the left wing are typically uninformed or overly carried by emotion. So what role does that have? What does the left generate? And I was thinking about this and I was going, art and music. But I also think that they gravitate towards using new things. So people on the left are going to be the first users of new technologies, new proprietary stuff, where people on the right are much more comfortable with what they know and that sort of thing. Um, what do we say? When someone says they just want out of the rat race and want a simple, peaceful life, society's wrong. What's this now? There is going to be no one who switches from working to homeless without a reason. This reason could be seen as society's failure. There are some people who choose to be homeless, although I think that's probably due to there are transients, who do like that, but they tend to move around, and then you get career homeless who tend to live on the streets in London and make a killing through begging and that sort of thing. And I think the incentives are wrong with the begging side of things. There's a woman who lives down my street who makes, I reckon, probably at least 60,000 a year and owns 2 flats, as far as I'm aware, who always comes down the train asking for money and that sort of thing. Is homelessness a sign of a free society? Big question. I don't think there's enough people choosing to be homeless that we could say it is in it of itself a sign of a free society. Let me see. Bizarrely, California has a massive homeless problem despite it being heavily left-leaning and pro-democrat, which shows that left-leaning governments aren't particularly better at solving social issues than the right. And I also think that's true, because the reasons why people are poor, shall we say, are multivariate. One of the biggest ones, which you emphasise with sort of heavy welfare provision, is you do not support someone learning to be financially responsible, because they don't associate the money that they're being given, one, with them being paid it, and they haven't earned it. So, except by existing, of course, which is not earning. So that most people I know who are on hardcore welfare, although they're not from California, aren't aware of where their money comes from. They don't think that someone who pays tax pays it. They just go, oh, it's just money from the government, and the government is this faceless organisation which will just sort of help them subsist. So there's that side of things. So it's like, I still think the main problem we have with the left is that people on the extreme fringes, say, need to have the support of the centre in order to enforce what they're saying, right? So even though most people think that there's sort of a slightly crazy edge to some of what the left does, because of the guise they do it under in Equality and that sort of things, and also most people are pathologically opposed to the Tories, who are viewed as right-wing, even though they're not. So because they're pathologically opposed to them, because they've done such a poor job so far running the government, and the alternate narrative is steeped in sort of the left's moral language, you don't end up with the resistance to the left that you do to the right. So if someone says, I want to take away welfare because I want, or a lot of welfare because I want to provide other means by which people will sort of be empowered to get up in the morning, to find work, to provide for themselves and their families, and I want to promote fiscal responsibility and the cohesion of the family unit, and that, I think, is better for people than to leave them sitting in a council house which has very little heating when their kids have diseases, because social housing is never very good quality, and I think that it's immoral, effectively, to abandon someone, chuck money at them and say, there you go, you're all right. I don't think that that's moral. People will have more resistance to that because they go, oh, you just hate the disabled then. You want people to freeze to death, even though people on the right typically have a different set of moral codes and practices. They're not very good at expressing it either. They tend to be quite utilitarian, which of course doesn't work when talking to the left, who are more concerned with the broader concept of well-being, and they don't I don't know necessarily whether or not the left thinks particularly doesn't think particularly long term, because I think particularly the hardcore socialists um, and people who are looking at social planning, central planning, etc., uh, think think long term insofar as they know what their goal is, and they know that the moral prerogative that they put upon themselves, sort of their own imposition on themselves, that they're doing this for a moral reason, is there, and then they get caught up in the middle. So I don't think they do much middle thinking. I think they think of what they can do in the short term, and they know what they're aiming at in the long term, and there's this big disconnect in the middle. So I wouldn't say that they don't think long term, whereas the right tends to, I guess, think long term and ignore the short term, even though they give a little bit more credence to the middle term. So the right would go, well, we should get rid of welfare, but they don't really think about the way in which they should do that, because there's a period of latency in between, right? So say they get into government, all welfare is now gone, the NHS is gone, whatever. It's going to take time for charities to rise up. It would take time for a private medical practice to get up. It would take time for the general population to adjust, and how many people are going to die in the interim, basically, because they have no food, or you suddenly have a massive homeless problem, and so on and so forth. So the idea of easing into things is something which can get overlooked. But there you go. Restrict welfare to citizens only. We already do, as far as I'm aware. Give welfare in the form of food and drink if they need it. If they're able-bodied, they get hooked up with private recruitment agency. Thoughts? We already restrict welfare to citizens, as far as I'm aware. You have to specifically have refugee status, in which case, to get anything else, in which case I think you're covered by the foreign aid budget, but don't quote me on that. Only give welfare in the form of food and drink is an interesting idea, but that's typically covered by... I always like the idea of a voucher system. I always like the idea that you would get these vouchers which the company can exchange for money, the private company can exchange for money, but that the owner of the ticket can only exchange for equivalent goods. So we used to have this with Sure Start, which was a program in the UK for kids who were in disadvantaged areas, and the mums in particular would come in and they would buy baby milk and essentials that way with Sure Start vouchers. So I liked that idea, in the same vein as if you see a homeless person who looks like they're struggling, buy them a pair of gloves or a meal or something like that, rather than just giving them a pack of money which you don't know what it's going to be spent on. How many people do you think are suffering right now anyway under the NHS and other public utilities? It's a big question, and I don't think it's one that has been quantified effectively by either side. So the left will point to gross figures and say this is the fault of capitalism. The right will take the same figures and say this is the fault of welfare and public utilities, and neither of them will agree. But I also don't think that the figures are right either. I don't think anyone has been able to do a study which effectively represents how many people are suffering specifically due to this reason. Because people are complex beings, and they have a huge number of influences on them. And some of it will be their own fault, some of it will be not their fault, and some of it will be other people's fault. But it's hard to pass where one ends and where the other begins a lot of the time. Homelessness usually is a city problem. Even though people live close to one another, there is little sense of community. And this is true in a broader sense as well, where we are losing sense of community as a nation. Multiculturalism in particular, which I always love to call colonialism. I don't think it's necessarily exactly true, because colonialism implies like a kind of how best to put it, like a unified goal, right? So I do not think, for instance, that a large group of people is coming with a singular purpose, which is to establish a colony and, I don't know, establish Sudan on British soil, right? It's not a colony in that sense. At the same time, the incentives are such and the doors are open for a lot of people from, say, Sudan come over, and they tell their friends back home, and they tell them how it's quite good over here, and they keep going, and it becomes then effectively a caravan of people who are transiting between here and in that country. So the incentives are wrong for migration in the first place, but I don't call it. I call it colonialisation, sort of tongue in cheek. Where was I going with this? It was community, yes. So, and these people have more of a sense of community who come in, and then you end up with disparate groups of little communities, and I just see that as walking backwards. You know, like we used to have this sort of rigid, I suppose, sense of smaller community identity, where you had London, and you had England, and you had Wales and Scotland and Ireland, and that, you know, even when you got to sizes that large, what ended up happening, of course, was war. Lots of fights breaking out in between, and then we learned how to normalise the differences between us and get on a little bit and sort of formulate a larger British identity, which prevented that. And now we're going all the way back and growing small communities with lots of different values in our midst, and then wondering why there is conflict, because they don't have the shared history of sort of learning to get along. There will always be people who fall through the cracks in any system. Yes, I agree. It's just a question of how many people and how large are the cracks. Small changes disrupt and get people angry. They'll make you cave and turn back around. You're talking about easing things because you need the shock to wake people up to the fact that the world has changed. This is another thing. It's like, but take a democracy, Mad Robot, in today's world. And I'm not proposing any solutions here. This is all thinking out loud, basically. If you're a government and you get democratically elected on the mandate that you're going to make, shall we say, the economy better, and the way that you do this is by just abolishing welfare, straight up. It's a shock. People suddenly get up and they go, right, and we're going to sell off all these houses. We'll give you the opportunity to buy your house if you want to, but if you can't, I'm afraid you're going to be evicted, and it's all going to be privately owned. To all the social housing, say, then one, you run into the problem of you're never going to get elected again because you've suddenly empowered or inspired rather a huge number of people who live in social housing, whether or not they are renting properly or not, and all of the people who are friends and family of those people to vote against you in the next election because you took something away from them. Like, regardless of how entitled they are to it, people will feel that they are entitled to it. And then how do you maintain control? The welfare state is so huge and impacts so many people's lives that it's very difficult. And where do you draw the line? Because you'll have a huge number of hardcore people who say all welfare must go, charities can deal with the disabled, etc. And then there'll be the other people who are sort of softer leanings, saying, you know, look, we probably should take care of the disabled, or people who are literally going to starve to death, or something like that, you know. And you can't either like arbitrarily restrict people's purchases, so you can't stop people buying, for instance, alcohol and cigarettes if they're on welfare, unless you use a voucher system, which comes with its own issues, I think, because you end up generating a black market where people end up trading, cigarettes for these vouchers and stuff like that. It doesn't exactly work, and so you end up with this shock, but also people will, sort of inevitably, if they're suddenly left bereft of support and they've never had to seek it before from anyone other than a state, they're stuck on the teat of the welfare state. How do you look after them? Very difficult. Of course, you could make it so sharp a shock that all the dissenters end up dying of hope. Do it in winter and do it when the food banks aren't full, and just have them all freeze to death. over the winter. Maybe that would be a solution. I'm going to go out and say it's not a solution. I'm just saying. Ridiculous. Have you considered telling Britisher he's now as important as Sargon? He's also been demonetised. No, well, that's silly. I might. It might make him feel a little bit better, but he'll probably make it something about. Well, he still gets money from YouTube. He's not been banned by PayPal yet. I do want to abolish the NHS and go private. I fully agree it must be done in baby steps. Companies can get prepared. Thoughts on state pension spending? I really don't know enough about state pension just yet. I had never planned to really claim one, seeing as I was heading for my military pension, and it's not been something which has come up recently, or that I've thought about. Is the NHS a moral good? Big question. I think I'm gonna have to think about that one a bit more, because I'm still not sold that it's pure evil, and I'm still not sold. Like, the biggest thing with the NHS that I see is the bloating effect, which tends to happen with all public services. So the idea that you end up with a huge number of sort of overinflated people at the top of the hierarchy who are very much incentivized to keep their jobs, and because of the central planning nature, they don't really have competition to go to. So where normally you would end up with like highly qualified individuals, and then they end up leaving, and then they'll form their own practice in a free market system, or so you would hope. You know, somewhere where they think they're going to make a profit, or somewhere where for humanitarian reasons they're going to do it. With the NHS, it's like most of the people come through the NHS, and that's the place to be if you're a humanitarian. So if you're more humanitarianly minded, and then you end up in the top bit, and then you end up with people trying to find jobs for you to do because you're overqualified, shall we say, to be in the halls, or you're too old because the hours are so long, and the workload is too heavy. So you end up in a real niche that's being funded by the government, but which isn't really affecting a significant portion of the population, because you don't really have big pharma. It's all done through government contracts, or imported from America. So very difficult there. So I would drain the top of the NHS, which would free up a lot of capital for the bottom. But I don't know necessarily whether or not that's a sort of an intrinsic. It's the intrinsic nature of public services. We already see it. The same thing happens in the military. Like, there are people at the top, and because hierarchies tend towards corruption, those people are very much incentivized to keep theirs and their friends' jobs intact, and so you end up with this bloating effect. Some places manage to keep it away. So, for instance, the US military, like the US Marine Corps, has got 6 times fewer senior personnel than the UK Armed Forces, which is about equivalent size. I've made this talked about this a number of times, and they think they've got too many officers, and they're just willing that if an operation goes badly, we'll fire you. Whereas the idea of being fired for messing up one thing, and it may not have been your fault in this country, is almost unthinkable. So I think we're missing that to a degree. Academic agent, good to see you in the chat. I was referred months ago by a doctor, and I still haven't heard from the hospital. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. As I say, again, one of the other consequences of the bloating effect is the salaries at the top are much higher, and so you end up with a lot of capital locked up in people who are doing things which is not the stuff at the bottom, all the bureaucracy, all the general stuff, all the making things fluid, and then of course the other problem of central planning, which is that contractors know that because it's public money they can rinse the government, and it's not a race to the bottom, but a lowest bidder gets the contract kind of thing, rather than looking at the quality of the product and saying we need exactly this, and you can either provide it or you don't have a good track record of providing it, and that sort of thing. It's exactly what happened with the centralisation system. So I have a huge problem, as I say, with the way the NHS is run, and I still basically haven't decided whether or not that the problems with the NHS are inherent because it is centrally run, whether or not it's something because of the mindset of politicians, effectively, who run it, like the Minister for Health, etc., whether or not it's a case of, because the public health service provides so many jobs, it almost is immune from general job cuts, and whether or not this sort of is a natural tendency because they have no competition. So, what do I want to incentivize private healthcare and strip away the much of the NHS so that it provides what I would consider to be a basic level of care? Do I want to abolish the NHS in its entirety, or do I just simply want to completely reorganise it so that it's much more bottom up in terms of personnel? So you end up with far fewer people at the top draining, taking 5 or 6 salaries worth of money away from where you could hire nurses, for instance. Idea: we put a time limit until the NHS will officially abolish, or I assume we mean be abolished. 2 years, for instance. The populace can prep, the state can sort out the tax code, companies can prepare. Thoughts? The British population would never allow it. You'd be like two years until the NHS was abolished, and then you'd set everything up to abolish it, and then you'd be voted out. You'd never win an election on the promise to break up the NHS, and if you didn't, and you got into power, and you then said, "Look, we're going to abolish the NHS," we'd have riots, like at the level of I think what Paris has now. In response to Macron's government overreaching, the British population would see this as an overreach. I just don't think enough people are informed, and the only alternative that they know is the US system, which is itself a bastardization of public and private healthcare, and it works even worse than ours. So, very difficult. Very difficult. I would not go so far as to say good intentions are inherently bad. No, they're not. Good intentions do lead to good outcomes. It's just that the road to hell is also paved with good intentions. And so the difficulty with intentions in general is that intentions aren't what matters. What matters is consequences. So you can have the best of intentions and the best of things can happen, and that's great because those are the consequences of your actions. If you look at the intentions of communism and the intentions of any utopian dream, they tend to be broadly positive intentions. They come from not normally a place of hatred and regret. It comes from striving for a better world, but they fail to realise they'll never reach that world, and the consequences of what they've done historically are negated effectively because the intentions are pure. The intentions are pure, but the consequences are not. I will be back in 2 seconds. I'm going to get a glass of water because my throat is now so dry. Oh, that's better. It's the academic agent causing trouble in the chat. You're telling me off for not drinking tea. There we go. Better not be herbal tea. We learn that intent doesn't matter? Keeping the trains on time is good, therefore fascism is good. Academic agent, what are you saying? Yes, so I think you're talking about the NHS being so pros and cons, like how many people is the NHS leaving behind versus sort of, it's like, because it provides something doesn't mean that it on balance that's the right thing. I agree. It's also very hard to calculate with something like the NHS what is effectively what the deaths are from the NHS specifically compared to negligence or old age or anything that, what was a preventable death, I think is harder to quantify. But I'll be interested in discussing that all sort of in future. When it comes to, what else was I talking about? Crime. Crime was the big thing that I wanted to talk about today. Sort of group identity in general, voting blocks and crime, as well as sort of identity politics, I suppose. Which is, it sounds like a lot of topics mashed in together. But there you go. Binary stat for very few are left behind under the NHS, i.e. untreated. Waterall stat shows that the quality of care it provides outside of life-saving is far worse than the private system. Wouldn't surprise me. That sounds quite reasonable. Did I already talk about the Sargon deplatforming? I mean, I did, but we can talk about it again if you want. Gab is working on an alternative to Patreon. Okay, interesting. Let me have a look, see if I can find something. And then I may share my screen or something. Gab working on alternative to Patreon. I'd be curious to see whether or not Gab does it, given that they were shut down by... what was it? They were let go by their internet provider, and PayPal was saying no, and that sort of thing. No one makes a living on Patreon? No. I can't see anything recently. Have they tweeted it out or something? Is that what's going on? I don't really know what to do about the Patreon thing at the moment. Like, developing an alternative to Patreon is fine, but it's not great if PayPal, Visa or MasterCard won't sign up to it. You can have the best Patreon system in the world, but if payment providers won't take you, then you need your own payment provider. You need at least £4 million in startup capital to make provider, assuming that you can make the software yourself and you're not paying millions for that as well. And even then, you need to make sure Visa takes you. Otherwise, we need an alternative to Visa, and that, I think, is even... you wonder how far off that is. Everyone's going to start using American Express. Gab's there on Twitter. Well, let me check Twitter. Gab. We have a full Patreon alternative baked into Gab and ready to go, including tiers, content options, distribution. We are finalising the underwriting process with our new payment processor, and we'll have this up and running in the coming weeks. Could be exciting. It's such a shame what happened with... I think Patreon was sort of hamstrung in that when it was in competition with Patreon and Maker Support, then there was a genuine sort of... They couldn't really afford to deplatform people because people would just go, okay, right, we're off to the other one then. We'll flock to another competitor. And now that they have what is in effect a monopoly until hopefully this Gab thing comes up, they they feel like they can suddenly do the Twitter and the platform whoever they want. Okay, but I wish them the best of luck. I look forward. I'll probably be following that one. If it ends up being semi-workable, I'll probably switch over to that at some point. There we go. See what the chat. Let the market decide, etc., etc. Okay. So I was going to talk about policing. So I was going to talk about the fact that we have this sort of growing concept of, I suppose, something which we haven't had in Britain before: racial divide. You see it mostly in universities. I was talking to one of the student university representatives, student union representatives, even someone who's getting there. He got elected on. All of the candidates were basically fighting on representation. They were all standing on representation as one of their key underpinning manifesto promises, as it were. And I ended up voting for the guy who I thought had the best and more rational idea about this. So he wasn't going to. I think he was the only one which wasn't going to basically exclude people based on their characteristics from voting on certain representatives, which is pretty horrendous. So, and whilst I disagree with him on a lot, that was best. But he did unironically tell me that I didn't realise I was failing until I saw the BAME attainment gap. And I said, what makes you think you're failing? And he goes, well, with this aggregated score, it shows that the dropout rate's higher and we score lower on our exams, etc. And I was going, but you're Indian. So Indians and Asians score above average if you take them separately. If you only go on the ethnicity route, you score higher. And he goes, oh no, but we're failing on a black and minority ethnic level. And I said, well, no, you're not. Because if you condense it down, your ethnic groups are doing better than, shall we say, native students, and then if you take it down to an even more individual level, you're a very high achieving, as an intelligent bloke, you're doing much better than the average student anyway. You're going on to do your PhD next year. And he goes, yeah, but and he couldn't get over this idea that he was failing somehow because this group aggregate stat was failing. And then the only thing I managed to get through to him was the only thing that he managed to take away from it all was that black students are doing the worst. Black students are doing the worst. So I was just like, I could not understand. But his idea of representation was more to do with for foreign students having someone who understands the issues which come with trying to come over here and study. So, for instance, Far East has a very different attitude to education than we do. A lot more rote memorization and a lot less sort of free thinking. And so he wanted effectively a support officer for foreign students to acclimatise them to this way of doing things. So I didn't have a problem with that in particular. How many ex-infantrymen go into the police? Seems like a natural fit, tough, well-trained, and can withstand tense situations. I don't really know. I don't think it's that much of a trend. Most of them tend to go into private security, mainly because the police, most infantrymen are looking for a bit of a change. It's funny. I knew a drill sergeant, sort of trained parachutist for a living and that sort of thing, and he went and became a taxi driver, because people get so sick of it in the end. But there you go. Isn't the NUS going to go bankrupt? Hopefully by April. That'd be good. That'd be great. People don't necessarily join because of the student discount. They tend to join because a lot of people get free membership of their own student union, and their student union pays to be part of the NUS. And then their student union offers them this card, and they go. And so most people don't really care. They just go, I'm at the university. Part of my university fees go to the student union. I have to be a part of it. I can pay an extra tenner or whatever it is for student, for 10% off my food. The police get beaten up by chavs on mopeds. That was disgusting. I saw that video. I mean, I don't really know what you could really do in that situation if you're someone by yourself being beaten up by 5 youths. Was I deployed overseas? I was not, although I did travel afterwards. So I was not in the military for very long. People always seem to assume I was in there for this huge amount of time, but it was really only 2 years or so. Unfortunately, my injury made it non-viable. Also, the military is not necessarily a good prelude to policing civilians. No. Yeah, it's very different. One of the things that I realised when I came out of the military was there was no way I was going to go back and work for a public sector company in the same way, because I can't say what I think. Whereas in the military, I could tell someone whatever I wanted with whatever colourful language I wanted, provided I was being accurate, and it wasn't an arbitrary reason for doing it. And there was also the banter aspect, but in the military you can say what you think to a greater degree. Although apparently not if you're an infantryman who supports Tommy Robinson. So there you go. Return of the Chad British Constabulary. When Peter Hitchens is bang on regarding police, I intend to talk to him a great deal about police in January. Looking forward to that. Should be good. The police now are mostly very soft. And here's something most people won't understand. They get less than 2 weeks training in self-defense and locking. This isn't enough. Yes, I agree. 100% agree. I say that because my sister's boyfriend is going into the police. And he is just... It's laughable what they get at the moment. Laughable. There you go. Calling me a base camper, maybe. And Soot's going asking for a full docs of binary server there. I'll tell you where he lives, Soot's going, but you'll need to donate quite a lot more through Super Chat, just saying. But when it comes to policing, I was thinking about this, and particularly like this idea that the right has that you get these crime wave increases due to illegal or legal migration when there's no integration. And then you also get this idea on the left that the socioeconomic divide forces people to... They go, people aren't hiring immigrants or whatever. And this means that they, end up in... or there's racism in society, and so you end up with these groups of people and they have no choice but to commit crimes, Whereas I tend to see it much more as a divide in policing. I tend to see it as a mixture of factors, but a two-tier policing system where you get told that, you may or may not be, you may be tarred with the word racist if you are investigating certain people, which we already have seen with the grooming gang scandals, etc., is a horrendous, horrible thing to do, and has very bad outcomes. Then you also get the... I think the nature of... So let me run through, because I've bullet pointed this, right? So I think there's a location divide, right? So I think certain areas are deprived and certain areas aren't. And if areas are deprived, then they, for whatever reason, it could be financially, it could be culturally deprived, then they struggle, breakdown of the family unit and that sort of thing, as well as generally lower paid jobs and so on and so forth. Or like inner city stuff where... antisocial behaviour is high, welfare is high, for instance. And I go, okay, so you've got this divide. The left wants to divide it along racial lines. I want to divide it against location, but the locations which are the most deprived end up also being, it appears, from what I've seen of the heat maps of London and the like, to be racially divided as well. I think there's a huge problem with London centrism, where everyone moves to London when they're young or when they emigrate here. You don't see anyone going, what, I'd really like to emigrate to Stoke-on-Trent. Seems like it's a really up-and-coming area. No, everyone ends up moving to London. And London's actually quite a difficult area to work in, shall we say, if you don't know, shall we say, the language, or if you don't know sort of how London itself works. And very easy, of course, because cities end up being a hub for crime in general, because there are a lot of suckers in cities, and a lot of tourists and all sorts. You end up with sort of this sort of place where it's easy to get into crime, or easier to get into crime in the city. Immigration gravitation towards capital to make money, which leads to a socioeconomic divide, because it's actually quite difficult. Most people don't make that much money, and a small proportion make all the money, which is why inner cities exist. And then you end up with most criminals are incentivized either by ignorance of the law or economics. So they become career criminals, but very few people are. So you could argue that there's ignorance or desperation or economics. I would lean towards saying that most criminals that are doing the most damage are economic criminals. But from if you're talking about from a financial damage, and if you're talking about cultural damage, it's ignorance or rejection. So it's either we live in a segregated community and we have imported all of our value structures and laws effectively from whatever country we've come from, and then we're doing things according to our way, and then when the British police come in and try and step in, or don't, which is more increasingly what's happening because they want to appear racist, then you end up with this normalised behaviour which is criminal, or it's a rejection. So you get things like the Sharia law sort of, and Sharia courts and that sort of thing, which is a pure rejection of British and Western tradition in favour of the Quranic laws. Other criminals incentivized by cultural differences, lack of integration, different value structures, see Islam, and that sort of thing. I've already talked about if the broader you go with group identity, the more you can call yourself victimized. But also this idea that because Britain is losing its identity, or has lost its identity, because it's lost its status as a sort of an imperial power, because it's also lost its sort of common purpose, I suppose. The people are more disconnected than ever, and the only communities you'll really find are, funnily enough, I suppose on council estates. I don't really see anyone in London as part of a community. When I lived in the southeast, I didn't really see anyone as part of a community. Most people were in community groups because of work. And again, I think this is also just due to the technology age. So you've also got this, so the rise of social media, people being more ostracized, people being lonely. Loneliness tends towards social media usage, and it self-perpetuates. So you end up with this, and whereas people who migrate come from areas with typically less of that, and more of a community spirit, and so it's no wonder that you end up with a community, and then of course you end up with the working class communities who now have a common enemy, as it were, in the form of this sort of invading colony that has just come and plonked itself in the middle of town, and is now changing the way everything works that they're used to and their tradition. So this is why I reckon that the intelligentsia, a lot of the middle class as well, have no community identity as such. Certainly nowhere near as strong as the working class, who tend to work together physically together. The concept of menial jobs being particularly building projects and stuff like that. There's a real community spirit there. The military aspect, there tends to be a real community spirit within the military, and so on and so forth. And then you end up with, even tradespeople. You get electricians who live who work alone, but they are connected intrinsically to the building industry. And that sort of thing. So there's sort of a wider network there, which is something which, say, web developer doesn't really have. I don't think that there's particularly a community of web developers, whereas I would say that the community of, it can be small, but a community feeling around labourers is much higher. And so you end up with these two groups, which is why, again, there's clashes. And then the police are not stepping in, so it becomes a sort of mixture between who's going to jump to vigilantism first. And I say that vigilantism on both sides because both sides consider that their values are incompatible with one another, and if they're incompatible with one another, well, you need to be out there enforcing your values in a vigilante-style manner. And this, of course, brings to mind the idea, particularly in London, of voting blocks, where you're going to get these people who are all going to vote along different lines, whether that's religious lines, whether that's along racial lines, or location lines. So whereas the middle class and the upper class, shall we say, you would think would vote along ideological lines, the sort of the lower classes will vote, not lower, I hate the term lower classes, right? The working classes and the migrant populations will vote along like these other divisions, these sort of more arbitrary divisions, where so you see this with the working class voting more nationalistically than the middle class, and the migrants voting racially, or religiously. So see the election of Sadiq Khan. Academic Agent has a really good the Academic Agent has a really good video on sort of he's got a video where he goes through the heat map of different areas, the percentage on welfare, the percentage migrant populations, and who voted what, and that's why he reckons Sadiq Khan was elected. I think that's really good. So it's going, you could make compromises, radical notion, I know, not as fun as vigilantes, and go, yes, but the difficulty is, Sitskoen, is, as I say, compounded by this two-tier policing system, where you try to make compromises, but you can't compromise on some things. So, for instance, the Pakistani rape gangs, you can't compromise with someone on that and say, you can do a little bit of that, but, only within your own community, say, right? No, it's utterly abhorrent. You can't do that. So, you have to rely on the laws of the land and the police to get involved, and if they're not getting involved, then you end up with these clashes, and then what do? You have to become sort of vigilante-esque. You get this in people who, knowing where their daughters are and not able to get to them because the police are stopping them from getting there because they go, you can't go to someone's house and beat them up. But we're going to turn a blind eye to these people, and social services are going to turn a blind eye to the fact that they're raping kids. Really awful. Let me see. There's also yes, and this is why, as I say, I don't think particularly Islam itself, as much as I find Islam abhorrent, I don't think Islam is the problem, as much as the enforcement of British law is the problem. So if you enforce the laws equally, you would not necessarily stop all of the rapists, but you would discourage it enough that it would not be prevalent, it would not be widespread, and you could probably get it down to a level where it was roughly equal with the amount that it's perpetrated in, shall we say, the native population. Because there will always be people who slip the net, unfortunately. And then, of course, you will end up with people seeing the police as the arbiters of justice and not favouring one group over another. Then you will end up with sort of more respect towards that, and it becomes normalised that you don't diddle kids, shall we say, in the this particular community, and so people are going to be more likely to report it where they see it, as opposed to going, oh, this is just normal, this is what happens around here. When you put it like that, I'm surprised not more people have been shot in mysterious, racially motivated hate crimes. When I put it like that, I mean the two-tier does mean two-tier. So one group has less policing and one group has more. And in an effort to extra appear not racist, you will heavily police the community which is there. So there's the case of the man who knew his 15-year-old was in this house, and he called the police and said, if you're not going to do anything, I will. And they arrested him about 20 feet from the house and stopped it. So anyone who everyone knows, in particular, that if they try anything on, and they, I think there's still not necessarily trust in the police, but sort of the attitude of the British public is you go to the police first, and then if the police won't do anything, the British attitude is very hold out to try and make something happen. We like authority structures, we like hierarchy, typically. Islam itself is part of the problem because there is no organisation of the churches, and each and every one of them could become radicals. This is systematic and happened within Christianity too, which is why, in my view, it should be adequately policed, and organisations which are found to radicalise or discovered to radicalise should be shut down. The deliberate institutional failures of British policing has convinced me that Britain needs a return to our history of bearing arms, as Hitchens mentioned. I don't know where I come down. Like I like. I like the idea of the right to bear arms. I look at America and its sort of gun culture, and I don't think we want that. And I don't necessarily know how to. I mean, I would legalise it. I don't know how to make it popular enough in the public mind, other than doing something which would instantiate a gun culture, which I don't think is particularly helpful. Sort of, we love our guns and that sort of thing. I like that the British have typically had an attitude that it's for hunting or sport, and that side of things, and self-defense if you really need it, as opposed to this is my peacemaker and there's that side of things. Although I do think that self-defense laws need radical reform in our country. Although I wouldn't go as far as stand your ground, which some states have, I know, in the US. But as Hitchens mentions, we do have armed police now, and it seems a little bit unfair or ridiculous that the police would be armed and the populace would not be allowed to be. In my view, I just think, in the nature of fair play, in the British sense of fair play. Yeah. I generally I'm attributing a lot of the problems at the moment to a sense of loss of obligation in the mainstream. The idea of destruction of the family unit, no shared religious value structure. Not that I'm saying we need a shared religious value structure. I just think that a shared value structure is good, but we did lose a religious one. Loss of obligation, loss of destruction of the family unit, loss of religious value structure which was shared, loss of sort of community mentality, has led to less responsibility personally, and by extension less obligation on a larger scale for your community and nation. And I think that's one of the reasons why the working class are being forgotten. I think it's one of the reasons why sort of the middle class is becoming more and more detached from one another and from the working and upper classes. And I think it's because people don't really feel that connected to who they are, where they come from, their personal history. I don't know that many people. I know more people from Scotland and abroad who know their family history, but I don't know that many English people who could trace their family history back beyond their great-grandparents, for instance, and by extension know their British history that well. And so again, this opens the door to swallowing all sorts of factoids and out of context statements, and also lies about from both sides. This is glamorizing or demonizing the British history and that side of things. An Englishman's home is his castle. I wish it was, but not at the moment. Okay, and that's about everything I want to talk about on that side of things. If anyone's got any questions in the chat, please chuck them at me, and I will attempt to answer them. If you're feeling particularly generous through Super Chat. But the other thing the final thing I wanted to talk about tonight was the direction for the channel. So what's next for Not So Obvious? that side of things, because I've been thinking a lot about what do what am I going to focus on. I've got I'm at university at the moment, obviously. I'm having to work aside. This isn't providing me with enough money to support me, so I'm getting a part-time job on the side, and then there's this channel. So I've determined I want to keep doing Fake Accents Unite, and I want to keep doing probably, if not a weekly news roundup, like I really pushed for not so newsworthy this last week, and I enjoyed doing it, and I hadn't done it in a while, and people seem broadly to want that one, but it's a lot of time, and I don't know if I'm going to get to it every week, but I will try. But I also want to make some topical content on sort of the day of it's released, and that's one of the biggest things, I suppose, to pass being a relatively political channel, is talking about whether I want to release, say, 4 or 5 videos in a week, and I make, some 5 to 10 minute videos, and they're snappy and punchy, and basically they it's on point and it's likely to attract views. Do I want to make the roundup because people like to sort of take their news all in one go, or do I want to make something else entirely? Because I don't know necessarily whether or not chasing the news cycle itself is particularly healthy for me as a person. It's very aggressive, it's very depressing and quite angry, but I still want to make content on some stuff, but like my most viewed videos are my rant videos, and I don't necessarily know when I want to do that. And my more conceptual stuff, like, struggles to break 1k views, which I'd like it to. I'd like to make stuff which is more thinky, to say the least. Like, I'm hoping that by taking the stuff I've talked about today, I might be able to make a couple of videos more like that. But I know that they won't do well in the viewership, so they've got to be passion projects. And I don't know if I can afford to spend the time on that right now. But that's just what I'm thinking about the channel, What was there before the Big Bang? Nothing. And then there was something. How's uni going? Not too bad. I have 2 assignments due this week, which I should be doing one of right now, but I'm talking to you guys instead. When you were in the services, did you ever meet an active seaman? Yes, I did. One of my, I'm going to call him lecturers at RAF College Cranwell, was a Navy officer. And that sort of thing. Anglosphere Trade Union. This is the idea that the US, the UK, and Australia, I think it is, and some other places to a degree in the Commonwealth, would have a sort of a trade union. I don't know whether that would work. I don't know whether or not I'm particularly a fan of trade unions in general, but I'd need to look at that. Trade bubbles, Should taxpayers get an extra vote based on their banded tax brackets? 20% tax, 1 vote, 40%, 2 votes. I think that would be an interesting way of potentially getting around universal suffrage, but I don't know necessarily whether or not people would accept that. I also wonder whether people would come in on the side of that if, say, they pay UK-based tax but they don't live here and that sort of thing. Very difficult. If a trade deal is longer than 2 sentences, then it's shit. Who's most deserving of a place in the Gulag? Anyone who thought up the Gulag. Possibly Goldsmiths University Student Union, who defended the Gulags. But I wouldn't really put anyone there. Right. Well, I think that's everything apart from a few trolley questions. So I'm going to... Oh, I have one £5 from Joan Everton. Recent British historical revisionism makes me ill. Arguably the most successful and celebrated, I assume that says, nation in human history, yet people want to destroy that. Yes, I would agree. It really grinds my gears to steal, whatever it was, Family Guy. I hate it. I also think that it's easy to glamorize, but at the same time, you have to take every single bit of history in the context of the world when it was then. It's like what the British Empire was an empire in a world filled with empires, where you were going to be part of one or you were going to be crushed. And if you had to be part of an empire, then the British Empire was probably the best one you could be under, because it would provide infrastructure to your country, probably wouldn't sell you into slavery, and at least maintained a modicum of relatively civil law. So if you take something like that, and then people go, well, it was immoral, and you go, it would be immoral today, but to back then, different world, different people, different cultures, different values, and I don't think the British erased that many people, to be perfectly honest, compared to some of these other places. But there you go. Right, I'm gonna finish off there. Thank you very much for joining me. So let's go and finally saying off there, the North Sea Empire never did anything wrong, but you would say that you're a little bit biased, and I wish you well. I hope you have a lovely evening and a good week, and I will hopefully have a video out for you tomorrow, which will be the next Not So Newsworthy, if I can find another couple of stories. Take care, everyone, and good night.